Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Lough.
The 105th session of the Indiana General Assembly is off and running in what promises to be a tax and spend session. How much you're taxed will depend on how much they spend. Today on Public Affairs Roundtable, we'll talk about the politics and priorities of this session of the legislature. Our panelists are Ball State University professors Bruce Galehood from the History Department, Ray Sheely from Political Science, and Gary Crawley, also from Political Science. I call it a tax and spend session. Republicans call Democrats tax and spend. But the Republicans, too, are going to have to come to realities here that there's going to be some taxation, right, Ray?
Well, yeah, let me observe, Larry, that Governor Orr, in his State of the State message earlier this week, to me, presented a remarkable speech. First off, he pointed out the bad news for Indiana, which is something you usually do not hear from an incumbent governor who has been responsible here for public policy in this state for nearly 7 years. And he did it in a way that, well, he called it courageous decisions were going to have to be made. Now, as to why he said that, obviously he cannot seek re-election, and he's looking to, I think, go down in history as a very strong governor in these last couple of years, particularly in the area of education. His major thrust has been education funding, and he flat out admitted that he's going to have a tax increase, and he's going to fight for it in this session. We don't have a long line of distinguished governors in Indiana, going back to 1816. And I think Governor Orr is, although he has kind of hidden himself, he's been a cog in a political apparatus, but I think he's emerging in these last 2 years with an idea that he thinks will leave his mark in this long line of governors. And the mark is going to be education, and he's going to raise taxes to try to get it done.
Well, on the political, if we can get into the political end of it a minute, don't we find that any governor in this situation is a lame duck who cannot run for re-election? The influence tends to wane a bit in the later years. Even Doc Bowen, someone as influential and popular as he was, saw this as a problem. Is that going to be a problem, Bruce, do you think, for Governor Orr in implementing his policies?
I would say that it would be, and I'd like to ask Ray a question relative to what he just said here in comparing perhaps Governor Orr's place in history with his predecessor, Doc Bowen. Is it possible perhaps that Governor Orr has been victimized by that bad recession of the first 2 years of his term, and he, unlike Doc Bowen, who worked very hard in his first term for property tax relief, and that's what he's going to be remembered in the annals of our state for. Perhaps Governor Orr is coming upon his issue, his contribution, his mark, whatever you want to call it, a little bit too late in his term, and the economic realities of the state worked against him when he perhaps was at his maximum point of political strength. He was in his first term, he had a strong majorities in both houses, and there you go. So what about that?
Well, I think that certainly the good news in the State of the State message was that, as the governor put it, we have weathered the recession probably better than any other state in the Midwest. We have the lowest unemployment rate. We've had some late success here in terms of attracting major plants, the Lafayette plant and, of course, the General Motors plant up around Fort Wayne. So that was a little bit of good news, but I thought the remarkable part about the speech was that was it. I mean, he spent about 5 sentences on the good news. The rest of it was the catastrophe awaiting Indiana and indeed the entire country if we don't do something with respect to education. And quite frankly, Hoosiers don't like to pay taxes. That's always a major issue in this state is tax increases. And the governor just put a frontal assault on it, that indeed he's going to twist arms to get a tax increase for education. So in that sense, sure, he may have been diverted for the first couple of years because of the Great Recession, but this is the issue upon which he's going to want to be remembered.
Well, or be remembered as the governor who was the governor of tax increases, the 82-83 increase, now perhaps the 86-87 increase. Is that a possibility?
Could very well be. Although the Republicans in this state poll very closely in terms of surveys. And I think that probably the Indiana polls show the same as national. People are willing to spend more on education as long as there's some accountability factor built in. The national polls show us the same thing.
But I think, you know, I mean, it's one thing to talk about the motives in terms of Governor Orr leaving a legacy or some other motive behind this, but it's quite another to talk about whether or not this package is actually going to make it through the state legislature. In one respect, I think the scenario in the legislature clearly has changed as a result of the '86 election, because now in the House there are 52 Republicans and 48 Democrats, which is a very close margin. And for years, Democrats have pushed for more education funding, et cetera. But on the other side of this particular issue is the entire package, the tax increase you've been referring to. And as I understand it, that's kind of a dual package in and of itself. That is, that the sales tax will be decreased from 5% to 4.5%, but there will be a tax implemented on services. And what's interesting from a political perspective there is you're talking about some very influential groups, interest groups, clientele groups that are going to come out, I believe, on the short end of this, or perceive it that way. That is, professionals, lawyers. You're going to use an attorney, you use an accountant, and so forth. You're going to have to pay extra for those services. And I suspect they're going to come out pretty strongly against that portion of the tax plan. And of course, Governor Orr has said, well, if the tax package doesn't go, the education package isn't going either. So I think, you know, it's an idea perhaps whose time has come, but they're going to have a tough time in the legislature. And also, Representative Kiley, who's chairman of Ways and Means, where the tax bill will originate, has pretty strongly indicated that this may not be the time for a sales tax increase in the sense of putting it on services and changing things around. So you have one of the most influential individuals in the General Assembly, the chairman of Ways and Means, indicating he's at the very least not wholeheartedly behind this plan. It's going to be a tough fight to get that entire package through.
Well, I guess that's the question. Who's going to emerge as the leader of this legislative session? Governor Orr has pretty much laid his plan out, but he got a lot of media attention for it. But that's pretty much where he stops. As a lame duck, he even has less influence than he has before. Who do we look to? Chairman of Ways and Means and Pat Kiley, Chairman of Senate Finance and Lawrence Borst. Are those the?
Well,
those
don't
going to be
discount the new speaker, Paul Manweiler, the new Speaker of the Indiana House. If you recall, I believe it was 3 years ago, the cross-county banking bill was first introduced, and that had the backing, obviously, Lieutenant Governor Mutz. It was recognized as one of his proposals, and of course Governor Orr and Speaker Daley did just about everything he could and managed to get the bill defeated. Now it passed the following session, but that's an indication that you need the House and Senate leadership of your own party behind your proposals before you're going to be able to get them through. And I, to this point, am not aware where Speaker Manweiler is coming from on this particular issue. I would suspect, given that he's a new speaker, probably trying to get his feet wet, that he would turn most of the influence and what have you over to Kiley of Ways and Means, and just kind of ride it out and see how the issue develops.
Manweiler is something of an unknown quantity in
That's
that
correct,
sense,
yes.
is it not?
But let me point out on the interest group part of it, we also have some interest groups lining up right now, all of whom have put out some pretty good price tags for increased educational spending. The Chamber of Commerce, which is a very influential lobby group, has a 7-point education package with a price tag of about $300 million. The governor's package is going to cost about $370 million. Now the Teachers Association, Indiana State Teachers Association, is out with a price tag of about $500 million. These, at least the Chamber and the teachers, are very influential lobby groups down there, and they appear to be lining up. There's differences, obviously, in the proposals, but they're lining up for increased educational spending at a pretty good clip.
But you see, what's interesting is that your discussion is split. I mean, all we've heard is discussion about the need for education and the cost and so on and so forth, and clearly the state's going to have to pick that up. We've had at least several areas where on the local level, people have voted down property tax increases for school. I mean, it's clear that people do not want the local level to be funding any increases in education. So on the one hand, you have, I would argue, consensus that we need support for education. It's the funding that's going to create a whole additional can of worms, and you're going to see some of the very same groups supporting education chipping away at any kind of a tax package, either in terms of favors for their particular interest or doing away with the whole notion of changing the sales tax as it is.
The very base of educational funding was the reason for the 73 Bowen property tax reform, is that property taxes were beginning, local property tax, carrying too much of a burden for spending in local education, which was skyrocketing, and local school boards had virtually no restraints and could raise taxes at will. And that's obviously a question that's going to have to be addressed. Do we give local school boards more of a say in how their programs are funded, or does the state continue to control it?
Well, I would agree on this point, and I think we solved it in 1973 with the Bowen tax package. Hoosiers do not want to fund education through local property taxes. You can take a look at the referendums around the state. Virtually all of them have gone down to defeat, with 2 exceptions. Consequently, Hoosiers are saying, well, we're ready to spend more on education, but we don't want it out of the local property tax base, which means that the state's going to have to come up with it.
We know that the property tax increases are unpopular. That's been proven, as you just mentioned, Ray. We know that the governor has come out with the idea of broadening the base, as he refers it, on the sales tax. What about the possibility of increasing income tax? Some interest groups who are lobbying for more education spending says this is the way to go, that we should increase the state income tax by 1%.
But there's also a proposal, hasn't gone far yet, that perhaps you give local school boards a local option income tax. Mm-hmm. But again, it's on income and not.
That's right. It's not on property. It's not on sales. It would be on income. Let me put it in this respect: would the Orr administration ever countenance something like that, considering that indeed the Orr administration had to propose and then see enacted an increase in the state income tax back in 82, 83, in that area there?
Well, there's several problems with that. As we talk about the sales tax versus the income tax, first off, the backbone of state finance is a sales tax. It is, if you will, inflation-free. Mm-hmm. Okay, it's a percentage tax, and retail sales continually go up, or even in a recession, decline at a slower rate than income does. Consequently, it's if we left it, the only projection I've seen is that if we left the sales tax at 5% and extended it to services other than medical services and dental services, we could raise somewhere between $600 and $700 million. Okay, now that's a huge amount of state funding all at once. And I think the price tags we're looking at for education, we're going to need that kind of commitment. Now, that's why Governor Orr was able to say, well, we can even scale it back to 4.5 and still raise the amount of money we need. Well, frankly, I think that a lot of people are going to say that's a sham, that's a shell game. Mm-hmm. If we're going to really raise taxes, let's go ahead and get it all at the 5% rate. Then that gives us the kind of cushion that we need for future initiatives,
but
whether
politically,
it be in education or elsewhere.
Politically, it's more difficult to sell.
I'm not so sure about that.
Because you see, well, for example, it seems to me that if you just want to raise taxes, why not raise the sales tax to 6% and forget the services? Mm-hmm. Which sure. Avoids the whole hassle of my having to pay this extra for services that I haven't had to before, and mm-hmm. for professionals and various other people providing services mm-hmm. to have to include these computations and so on and so forth. Why not just raise it to 6%? Because if you just raise it to 6% to increase your revenue, it's not going to sell politically. Mm-hmm. Politicians are unwilling to raise taxes. The only reason they're talking about the sales tax as opposed to the income tax, I would argue, is the income tax, people notice it. It's more noticeable for them than a sales tax is. A sales tax, your nickels and dimes dribble away, with the exception of your big ticket items. Mm-hmm. But your income tax, every time you get a paycheck, there's your state income tax on there. So I think a lot of the proposal that's been made in terms of going to the 4.5% plus tacking on services rather than going all the way is politically motivated. It's the only possibility, I think, that Governor Orr sees for this having a chance to pass.
Well, the governor does point out that by extending it to services, that is the fastest growing sector of the economy, is our commitment to services, whether it be realtor fees or lawyers' fees or accounting fees. More and more people are starting to utilize those types of services. And consequently, that's where the revenue impact becomes fairly major if you extend it into that base.
There's another snare politically in this, I think, too, and perhaps both of you as political scientists may want to comment on it. There's even sentiment, I think, in the Republican Party now is saying a tax increase is a tax increase, a tax is a tax, and simply to earmark a tax increase for a specified operation of government, such as education at the state level, which admittedly is about 58% of total state spending now, is wrong. That if there's going to be a tax increase that's going to be leveled on all Hoosiers and they're all going to pay it, then it ought to be for roads. Part of it may be for education, but part of it might be for roads, part of it might be for various other operations of state. And to make it more palatable, what the governor's going to have to do is say, all right, maybe the lion's share will go to education, but we need new roads, or we need improvements in roads, and various sorts of things like that. What about that?
Well, my understanding,
will he have to back off on education to a certain extent?
Well, my understanding, Bruce, is that the increased revenue from the sales tax would pour into the general fund and then be appropriated under the governor's guidelines for education spending, so that future legislators would still be able to appropriate that money any way they see fit. It wouldn't be earmarked permanently like the Bowen sales tax increase back in '73 was to property tax relief. It's not going to be that kind of dedicated appropriations process.
But on the other hand, in terms of the overall budget, all of the projections are rather bleak from the standpoint of revenues coming in. Of course, we need a balanced budget in Indiana constitutionally. I mean, they're talking about minimal increases in the budget, maybe just to cover inflation, and that's about it. In fact, some areas being cut somewhat. So I think Bruce raises a valid point in that there are people who are going to be suffering from this, and they're going to be looking for ways to get around no increase funding for their particular programs and what have you. And one of the ways would be to get into this money if the sales tax did pass. Of course, you mentioned roads. Now, another proposal that's been thrown around is increasing the state tax on gasoline to pick up the bill for roads. So, you know, we might watch that one as well. They're talking anywhere, well, the figures I've seen are 5 or 6 cents and some higher to to help defray the cost of just maintenance.
Well, aren't we seeing, though, in Indiana the effects of federal policy, taxation policy, as a result of Reagan's '81 income tax cut? That, in fact, the state of Indiana is talking about raising taxes. The city of Muncie and other cities are now looking more closely at their option for a local income tax. Aren't we going to start paying the piper now that, in fact, we've enjoyed that federal income tax cut, but it was with the understanding that the states are going to have to start picking that up? Isn't that just logical that we're going to have to see these local tax increases?
I don't think there's any doubt about that, and I think that was kind of the hidden agenda behind the federal tax cut some years back. But let me also suggest that as the states rush in to raise taxes, and most of them have, mainly because of the recession pressures back in '81 and '82, Uncle Sam still isn't out of his deficit problem. There's going to be a tax increase coming out of Washington, too, perhaps not under the Reagan administration, but there's only 2 years left of that. There's going to be a tax increase, and by then state taxes will have gone up, and we're going to come back in with a fairly large hike in federal taxes as well. Now, let me make a larger point on this, however. If you compare America, the United States of America, to any other Western industrialized nation, we have a very low tax burden in this country. A lot of even conservative columnists, such as George Will, points that out continuously. Consequently, maybe as in a comparative frame of reference, we're not going to be all that bad off by paying more taxes, both at the state and the federal level. On the other hand, it's not politically popular.
Yeah, you still have to sell to the people, and they're not thinking about what people pay in taxes in Great Britain or France. They're thinking about what I paid last year and what I'm paying this year.
Sure.
Okay, let's move away from the tax and spend. What are other issues are we looking at in the session of the legislature? Certainly,
Lottery bill.
the lottery will get a lot of attention. Where are we going with that?
Stands a very good chance of passage for several reasons. First of all, one of the major opponents in the legislature was Speaker Daley, who was defeated in last fall's election. he had the ability, if not to block the legislation at some point later in the process, he certainly had the ability to assign it to a committee on which, of course, he appointed the committee members and the committee chairman, that he was pretty sure was going to bottle up that legislation. Now, the political pressure last year became so great that, literally was forced to hand the bill down, and it passed. But Speaker Daley is now gone. Speaker Manweiler has come out, at least in a lukewarm fashion, in favor of the lottery bill, if not of the bill itself, of putting up to a vote by the people in the referendum, which would occur in 1988. So that's one major factor, major stumbling block in the past that is no longer present. Second, it's pretty clear that there's membership support. Once the bill came to a vote, the Senate has supported it for several years. And then once it came to a vote on the floor of the House, it passed by a relatively easy margin in the House, and most of those members are back. Third, I think there's evidence from the election this fall that the electorate wants to vote on this. I mean, there were several candidates defeated who ran largely on an anti-lottery platform or issue position in their campaign, and they were defeated. I think there was a clear message there that that the lottery bill is an idea whose time has come, at the very least, in terms of allowing the general public in Indiana to vote on it. So I think that easily will pass, and it will pass this year. There's no reason for it not to.
As a resolution, it did pass last year. It then goes to a vote of a statewide vote.
It has to pass
in 88.
2 successive general assemblies and then go on the general election ballot. That's right.
And we're talking about essentially a nonpartisan bill here,
Yes.
or a bipartisan bill. As a matter of fact, there are not party lines involved in this kind of legislation.
No, not
The UPI, United Press International survey of the House members show that there's already 51 committed votes for the lottery bill. And of course that's what it takes to pass, is 51 votes out of the chamber. Consequently, I think it'll fly this year. If the electorate approves it in 88, all it does is allow Indiana to have a lottery. The legislature must then come back and pass legislation implementing the lottery. So we're not going to have a lottery in this state, even if everybody approves it, until at the earliest 1990.
That's correct.
Okay, well, other non-money items coming up?
There are a few minor items that are minor in terms of, if you look at education, lottery, other things like that, but utility regulation, utility policy relative to measured phone service, increasing energy prices. I'm sure the public is going to press the legislatures to look at the way that these sorts of things are handled around the state. We've had deregulation of many different industries, and that's the communications industry being one of those, and that's going to have to be looked at. It's a minor issue, but it's an emotional one.
Along the lines Bruce is talking about, one bill that is almost certain to raise a little controversy is the measured phone service by Bell.
Paying per call?
That's correct. Paying for calls instead of a flat rate and free local calls. There's going to be a real effort to ban that measured phone service alternative in the legislature. Also, there are a couple of somewhat interesting bills. There's a bill providing for quarantine for people who have AIDS. That is sure to raise some controversy, at least if it goes very far and gets out of committee and is discussed on the floor. There is also a bill coming back to cross-county banking issue. There will be some legislation to increase the proportion of Indiana deposits that a holding company can have. Currently, for example, a Bank of Ohio comes in and buys up, a holding company buys up banks in Indiana. There's a ceiling on the amount that they can hold, which is, I believe, 11%. So there are going to be some real efforts to increase that. That probably won't receive much public attention, but it's going to be a major issue in terms of the legislature and fights among various factions down there.
It was sort of a foot in the door measure for cross-county banking, and once that happened, we're really moving toward deregulation of the banking industry altogether, are we not?
Yes, I believe so. There's going to be legislation, anti-smoking legislation, especially given the recent reports from at the national level and studies that have come out indicating that you know, if you're in the same area as someone smoking, then there's a cause and effect there. So there's going to be some legislation along those lines, and that's going to create some real controversy.
Gary mentioned the AIDS issue and the statements. I presume that you're referring to the statements that Commissioner of Health Woodrow Myers has made about that and so forth. Is this really the only issue of the ones that we've discussed that's an emerging one? All the others have been with us for a while. All the discussion that you hear out of the public health community and even out of Washington now is that we're going to see 10 times as many deaths resulting from AIDS within 5 years as what we have now. It's the burden of expense for treating and dealing with AIDS patients will be somewhere in the neighborhood of $5 to $5 billion. I assume that Commissioner Myers is very serious about this and wants the Orr administration to get behind him on bringing this matter to the legislature's attention.
Yeah, I think it is one of the few new issues, at least that I've come across, that they're talking about. Of course, it's a relatively new problem. But virtually anything else that you look at, for example, the ban on smoking in public places, the cross-county banking, or the budget fights, when we're going to have another budget fight over who gets cut and who gets increased, even at minimal levels, the education, those are all issues that periodically they're going to arise again, and we've had legislation. On the AIDS question, it might be interesting just from the standpoint to see where the battle lines are drawn, because I can't see that, at least on the face of it, as being a partisan issue. And so it'll be interesting to see, where the lines are and where.
A closing
people cut.
question. Democrats have 48 votes in the House. The first time this decade they've really had any influence in either chamber. Is that going to have some significant effect on what is accomplished, Ray?
No doubt about it. The Republican caucus it takes 51 votes to pass. They've only got 52 Republicans. All it takes is one or two desertions, and the Democrats control the agenda on the House side.
Well, beyond that, you need 2/3 for a quorum to conduct business. And all the Democrats have, which is 67 votes, or 67 members present in the House, and all the Democrats have to do is walk off the floor, and that's it. So I think, they may not even be thinking in terms of coming up with 51 votes. They may be thinking in terms of coming up with 67 members so we can do something.
Okay, we're out of time today. Thanks to our panelists, Ray Sheely, Bruce Galehood, and Gary Crawley for their commentary. I'm Larry Lough. Thank you for joining us.
If you have comments regarding this program, please address them to John Rouse, Box 149, Muncie, Indiana 47305. The producer for Public Affairs Roundtable is John Rouse. Associate producers are Cecil Bohannon and Bill Mosier. This program is a production of University Media Services, the Department of Political Science, and radio and television stations on the campus of Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana. If you have comments regarding this program, please address them to John Rouse, Box 149, Muncie, Indiana 47305. The producer for Public Affairs Roundtable is John Rouse. Associate producers are Cecil Bohannon and Bill Mosier. This program is a production of University Media Services, the Department of Political Science, and radio and television stations on the campus of Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana.